Thank you, John, for this invitation, and to Clarissa for coming from LA, sunny and warm, to this very snowy day. We'll use a very different format today for the panel. Clarissa Tossin was born in Porto Alegre, Brazil, and is a visual artist that uses installation, video, performance, sculpture, photography, like everything, to negotiate her ideas of hybridization of cultures and the persistence of difference. She received an MFA from the CalArts and also was a core fellow at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston from 2010 to 2012, which is very important for my conversation. I want to take more time because we're a little behind schedule, and I want Clarissa to come and present her work, and then after that we'll have a conversation and we'll open the microphone for some questions. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Jorge, for the introduction. Thanks, John, for the invitation to be part of the symposium. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks, everyone, for coming. So I was given only 20 minutes, and I will rush through a lot of images and give you an overview of two bodies of work that I think that are relevant for the topics we are discussing today, and hopefully we'll be able to get to more details during the conversation. As Jorge mentioned, I think I'm Brazilian. I was born in Brazil, and I grew up in Brasilia, Brazil's modern capital. So architecture played a very important role in my foundations as an artist, even before I decided to study art. And I keep going back to unacknowledged narratives related to the built environment in my work. And the body of work that I will show now deals with the Mayan revival style of architecture that is a modernist, considered a modernist style in the US. And in LA, you have a lot of examples of buildings from this time period of the 20s and 30s. So these are the two video stills of a video titled Chu Maya, which means Maya Blue in Yucatec Mayan, shot at a Hollyhock House. The Hollyhock House is a Frank Lloyd Wright house from the early 1920s. It's one of the 1919 from 1921, actually. And it was like the first house that Frank Lloyd Wright built in LA that is very influenced by pre-Columbian architecture, especially Mayan architecture. And I made this video, and I will play at the end. Since I have only 20 minutes, I'll play a few minutes at the end of this presentation. But it's a video where I studied, actually, Mayan ancient Templar architecture and looked at the similarities between that building, the Hollyhock House, and some Mayan structures, and came up with a dance performance to film in the house. And I collaborated with performer choreographer Clarissa Sepulveda that you were seeing in the images. And I looked at depiction of performers, processions, dancers, or really only even like the royal bodily gestures and behavior portrayed in Mayan ceramics and murals. And these are just a few examples. I was not looking for the Mayanistas in the audience. I was not looking at a specific time period or region, but really just looking at an extensive amount of images, mostly sourced from LACMA's website and Shirley's drawings, those drawings that you are seeing here, and the Mayan Vase website, that is another extensive collection of Mayan objects. and also a book written by Matthew Luper, To Be Like Gods, where he makes like an extensive study of performance and architecture in Mayan ancient civilization, and gets to today, actually. So here I'm just sharing a little bit of the rabbit hole research that I got into by looking at that building and coming up with the performance. So as I said, I'll play later. This image is from a show at the Whitney from last summer called Pacha Yatka Washise. Hopefully some of you saw that. And the sculptures that lead you to the film were actually made looking at another Mayan revival building in LA, the Mayan Theater. I know that the Denver has a Mayan Theater too. I went yesterday to visit it. So the Mayan Theater in LA is a really mashup of references from different Mayan archaeological sites that I think were available to Francisco Cornejo, who did the interior design and facade for the building. And really mostly the sites that were that you can find the images in the building are mostly from Quirigua and Piedras Negras in Guatemala and the Yucatán Peninsula. So what I did a little bit of an archaeological study of the interior of the theater. I had help of scholars, Mayan scholars, who walked me through specific imagery references that were used to, make all the interior design. And I tried to bring information from this research back into the sculptures. So here, what you are seeing, this folded latex, not latex, I'm sorry, this is silicone. Silicone imprint of this half door in the movie theater. And this is a feather serpent. It's a whole scene. It explains here, Lintel 25 from Yashilan. And it has like the feather serpent, which is like an important deity, cosmology figure in the Mayan cosmology. And I bring references to that, to the sculpture. But this whole body of work on Mayan revival architecture is very much based on the relationship between the architecture and the body and the performative quality of those structures. So I wanted to create a series of sculptures that had like bodily qualities, but it would speak to all the references that are in the architecture. So you have like this really long braid, and you see that Crystal in the film also has a braid at a certain point. And you have like the feathers, and that are not quetzal feathers, they are dyed rooster feathers. And that's another thing that I want to point to. All the list of materials, if you read, they point to faux materials. So you have faux serpent skin here in this one. If you go a little, this is not terracotta. This is dyed plaster to imitate terracotta, so it's faux terracotta. This is just part of my research. I don't expect you to read, but just to show how I was sourcing the image and trying to educate myself about actually the references that were used to create that building. Just another view. The title of this specific sculpture, actually, it's the most open-ended one. That is a cycle of time we don't understand, reversed, inverted, and rearranged, because that's what it was made with all the hieroglyphs that were used in the movie theater. They were either altered to a point where you cannot read, or they were just inverted in a certain way that you can still recognize, but it's not exactly what the hieroglyph was. And most of the hieroglyphs used, they were calendrical hieroglyphs, but then they are mixed together from different time periods and places, which breaks up with all the ways that Mayans had to count time, and also plays with the time of the present, looking back at these structures. So here you have like the full jaguar skin. Here is the reference for that here. This is the Mayan theater now. This is how it was, I think, in the 70s, painted all colorful. This is the stela that was used and reinvented here. It's ruler number 6 from Kiriga. It looks very cartoonish, right, in comparison to the original stela. And this piece makes reference to the fact that one heel, when a figure is painted with one heel up, that means that that figure is dancing, performing, and I wanted to bring that iconic aspect of my research to the sculptures. This is again like faux jaguar skin, and obviously not skin, I'm sorry, fur. So jaguar fur was used for the costumes that were used in performances, but here again, I'm like re-emphasize all the fake quality of these elements. Okay, these are just the final two. Oh, this is the only, it's really hard to. Ushan Khalil, it's actually one hieroglyph. It's the only one in the movie theater that is completely recognizable and made to what it is in reality. And it's the beginning of an ascension sentence for when a ruler is taking power. I hope I'm explaining this correctly. And so the title of this specific piece is after this hieroglyph, and it has some references to that. Also, there is an issue of scale. If for those who visited the archaeological sites, the hieroglyphs here are really enlarged, right? They are usually much smaller, so it's interesting. This was a column in the movie theater, and I just titled the piece "Shed Column" because also it brings like the animal, like how the animal world is also very much part of that cosmology and how that can be in conversation with the bodily aspects that I wanted to bring to the sculptures. And now I'm jumping to a completely different body of work that looks at the Amazon region, and specifically the presence of industry in that region and how that affects or is in conversation with material cultural production that follow indigenous traditions in the region. So there are previous works that I made about the Amazon, but this one, it was looking specifically at the presence of industry in the city of Manaus, which is the capital of the Amazon state in Brazil. And it was the rubber capital when the rubber extraction of rubber in the Amazon forest was bringing a lot of wealth to Brazil. That was like the most wealthy city in Brazil. Once synthetic rubber was invented, the economy of that place just doomed, and the government decided to put a free trade zone there that today became a really big industrial park. And the electronics is the industry that receives more subsidy. So you have, for example, the Apple manufacturers in Brazil or in South America are in the middle of the Amazon forest in Manaus. And so you have like Panasonic, Sony, Dell, all the gadget that we use to be connected today, all that those electronics, they are produced there, and also motorcycles and sodas. So you have like Harley Davidson, Honda, Kawasaki, all the big motorcycle brands are there, and so is Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Guaraná, and so many others. So what I wanted to do was like to comment on that industry, but by teaching myself how to use some traditions, material traditions from the region. So I taught myself how to weave, but using materials that are not like the organic fibers, right? Taking from the immediate environment from different communities, but using weaving. This is vinyl, and this is a satellite image of the Amazon River, from the mouth of the river, from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to Manaus, where this city is. And this is basically the part of the river that cargo ships traverse, bringing raw material to be processed in the industry and also taking the products back to be distributed. So I printed this image twice, the same image, and woven it into itself. So it's almost like mimics the flow of the river. That is also a big metaphor for how cultures and our exchanges, how people traverse this space, how materials, right, and objects are also in circulation. In addition to that, I cast in terracotta. This is real terracotta ceramics. This is not fake. And obviously, it was important for this work to use a material that it would refer to the production of ceramics in that region. So I made replicas of a wide variety of electronics that are produced there, but also a motorcycle tire, a printer, iPhones, and Coke bottles, and everything that I mentioned before that represent those industries there. And I also started weaving indigenous baskets out of Amazon.com boxes. And the issue of semantic displacement is used a lot in my work in different ways, and here's one example of that. But also the Amazon box, it's like this ubiquitous objects that stands for the circulation of goods in our world today, and I thought it was very relevant for the topic that I'm discussing here. So you have those baskets, and I was looking specifically at Baniwa weaving tradition and Iekuana. And I chose first the Baniwa, and I chose them because they are a very active group that has, like, there's schools or bilinguals. They have an NGOs where they actually produce baskets and sell in stores in Brazil that are like the IKEA, the Tokstok IKEA, Brazilian IKEA. So they have actually a place of exchange of their goods in I wouldn't say a global market, but at least like a domestic market. So and this is always mentioned in the text of the work, like where these patterns of weaving come from. And okay, this is another jump. This is a whole new body of work. I will just show the baskets. Thinking about the Amazon, I start reading Octavia Butler because of a trilogy that she has that takes place in the... Octavia Butler is an African, for those who don't know, I think she's very much current today. People are reading a lot of Octavia Butler. She's an African-American sci-fi author. I'm not a sci-fi person at all. I think I had read like one sci-fi book before getting into Octavia Butler. And I think I read almost all her books by now. But I started from this trilogy that takes place in the Amazon. And she uses the Amazon forest as the starting point for a new civilization that is a hybrid civilization between aliens and humans. And it's very interesting how she uses a lot of Amazonian indigenous traditions, aesthetic traditions and otherwise, to actually bring features to her aliens or the hybrids, not the humans. Those are the ones that have those qualities, using things that made me think about shamans, but also made me think about Anthropophagia manifesto in Brazil, and some other references that perhaps were not even part of her references, but were part of my reference related to the Amazon. And it's interesting that now I'm starting to think more in this, looking at the Amazon as a place to do some speculative thinking about what it could be, that place in the future where actually all these cultures will be, or the indigenous knowledge and culture will be side by side with some other traditions in a way that is much more, I don't know, healthy than it is today. And so this is a continuation of weavings. They are more elaborate weavings, but they are part of the same tradition. And here I was printing images of either, they are all NASA images, by the way, or Google images, which are NASA images, of the region, the Amazon, when they are green, or the river, or then the universe, like stars, the Milky Way, Mars. Mars is also the only planet that human beings, in the novels, that human beings can go to start a civilization that it's only by humans and not by hybrids. If you stay on Earth, Earth is another planet, it's another place, and will be hosting a different kind of civilization. And obviously, in the process of doing this, I've learned that Jeff Bezos actually has a rocket company, and it's very much on the race to colonize Mars. So also, if we're going to think about colonial ways of thinking, Mars is again like the next frontier, where we are like just replicating again some old ideas of how to go about conquering some new territory. So yeah, there is more about this body of work, but I thought that only the baskets would make sense for this conversation, and I think I will, yeah. And oh, there is the video. I will. It's 18 minutes long. We can't really watch the whole thing. Now I'm all right at 20 minutes, so I will just jump through. Just give an idea. By just like jumping, and it's just to give a sense that there are many different moments to the film, and I'll play maybe the last 2 minutes. This is obviously by looking at murals, and it's trying to replicate some situation. Okay.
Thank you so much, Clarissa. Wonderful to see your work. A couple of announcements. First, which is very important, please remember that you can use cards for your questions, and then on each side we'll have a person with a microphone, and that will be very useful. And the other is to my dear colleague Florence. Watch out, Tiger is coming strong the next fashion season. So I think it will be great to sit down in this very elegant salon with Barcelona chairs to talk a little bit on your work, Clarissa, and some ideas. I don't know if we have microphones to do that. I just want to introduce a little bit some ideas. Clarissa was in Houston from 2010 to 2012, and it was a really important moment because in 2012, my dear colleague and friend, Mari Carmen Ramirez, published an enormous book, near 1,200 pages, called Resistant Categories, Latin American and/or Latino Art, which is very important because she was trying to shed some light on what is Latin America, what is to be Latin American or Latino. It is a construct, but it's persistent since the 1860s. And what is this notion of Pan-Americanism? How are we dealing with these collections that are appearing across the United States of Latin American art, Latino art, and how we connect that? And on one side is a very utopian idea that you are feeding a bunch of different things, a plurality, a cultural plurality into a single container. On the other side is this persistence of differences, which is very important. And is Latin America this kind of a space that is an in-between between European colonial and post-colonial cultures and the later, I will say, U.S. imperialism or kind of big powers imperialism? And what is happening today here, because we have this very important component of what now we call the Latino, Hispanic, Latinx culture. And for Clarissa being in LA, and you mentioned that you experience culture in LA in a different way, and you learn how to speak Spanish, being Brazilian, which is, I think, is very important because it's the future, Clarissa. And the way that contemporary art is dealing with that is I found like really very important since the late 1990s, when Gerardo Mosquera, the Q&R critic, stated that because Latin American is an invention, basically an European invention from the 1860s, we can't reinvent Latin America as a category. And I think that this is a little bit what happened with the exhibition at the Whitney, in which artists from that we had like some kind of connection with the region, with different countries, embrace the concept of Latino, Latin American, in one way or the other. And I was thinking, is this an appropriation? The idea of embracing such a broad concept and circulating those images. In your work, you were circulating ideas from the Mayan culture that disappeared a long time before the Spaniards came into Mexico. And you were experiencing a culture that we can say is a little bit alien to a Brazilian. and using as a filter, right, neo-Mayan buildings. And I would like to discuss a little bit of that and how your exposition in LA to different aspects and culture of the different communities that share this space, this Latino space in LA, inform your work. And how do you feel about dealing with these traditions and being also yourself an immigrant and an artist? I think that we should go.
Sure. Okay, so as you mentioned, I've been living in LA for about, on and off, in the US for 10 years, and most of these years in LA. But it took me a long time to feel comfortable doing work in the city, feeling that was part of my history, and I had one way of talking about that. It's not the only way. So I have a extensive ongoing body of work on Brasilia, and even from LA I was doing still a lot of works about Brasilia until I felt comfortable and felt relevant to start this body of work on Mayan revival architecture in LA. And as you mentioned, it's like the experience of culture is so much more complicated and complex than any territorialization that may be imposed either through nation state, race, ethnicity. As you mentioned, like I've learned how to speak Spanish in Los Angeles and not in Brazil, and it's like maybe because I'm Latin American in the US, I am expected to speak Spanish. But actually I learned that in LA, and I've learned so much more about Central American cultures and Mexico in Los Angeles than I have ever thought I would in living in São Paulo or Brasilia, that are like the place where I lived in LA. And it's like the first time that I went to Mexico City, I was like, oh, okay, this is just a continuation of Los Angeles, really. I'm just like, it's all the same thing. Let's talk about regions and how culture is not, things don't end when you have like a nation-state border, right? That the exchange among people is much more complex and fluid. And in my work, I think I try to acknowledge that and not essentialize that, because that I think it's one of the dangers, right? I think there is the theorization of culture, and then what I started naming like the experience of culture, because that's the place from which I can speak. And there is like in LA, there is like a huge Mayan population, and I thought it was really interesting to do that work and to basically claim those buildings as belonging to part of a different history. So you can talk about them as being part of like the modernist architecture history, but also let's talk about them as part of a lineage of buildings that starts from, Mayan architecture. Let's talk about them in many different ways, and each artist will have a different way to talk about that. And I feel that we need this multiplicity of views for the same subject. So and in order to do that, they have to come from different places, right? So I want to see the Native American artists commenting on European art, and it's like things, because that's how, at least in my experience as an artist and a person in the world, that's how my experience goes. And I'm usually taking from things that I've experienced, places that I visited or spent some time. So it's not only the internet research, but it really has some connections with my life experience.
So do you feel somehow that being in LA and experiencing these, I would say, transnational world of different Latin American countries, like in a single place, in this melting pot that is LA, and kind of finding some shared values in between all different communities is a form of appropriation, or you are kind of, producing a tribute to this common ground that is south of Rio Grande experience.
Yeah. So I feel that being in the U.S., I am forced to have a Latin American identity that I don't really, if I'm in Brazil, I'm not thinking about that, or if I'm in other places, I may not think about that in those terms. And being in LA specifically, where we do have like a fantastic, super diverse Latino or Latin American, or people from the Americas, as I would prefer to say, like all in this same place, you start negotiating your place within all those references. And those references come from impositions, but also from your friends and the people that you meet, because then you are part of that cultural fabric. And I think it has to do with negotiating your place, or like stealing like home, like finding that place where you can, all those cultures become part of your culture because of the experience that you had from moving to places. So I'm talking also from the point of being an immigrant who's been here for 10 years, and I am like the typical example of an immigrant that goes back. So I go back to Brazil, and then I don't belong there 100% any longer, right? People in Brazil will question me it's a very in-between, complicated place to be, but also a very interesting and vulnerable place to be sensitive to learning about other culture, experiencing other cultures, and in a very, which I believe to be respectful and appreciative way, bring that into the work. And like a word that sticks with me more than appropriation is things that are not acknowledged, because we are constantly, as people and as cultures and our economy, we are constantly exchanging. I think the problem is how things are not acknowledged, how histories are written in ways that things are erased. So if things are named, if things are not invisible, then they start to exist and have a different space that they occupy. Yeah. So with the show at the Whitney, it's like there was so much criticism with the title of the work, which is Quechua, and I was like, yeah, it's hard. It's super hard to say that words and learn those words. But if we don't make that effort, they will always be invisible. The moment that you start acknowledging that, oh yeah, that's a language that I don't know, but it's the indigenous languages that is the most spoken in the Americas. Oh, how about I know 3 words about that, and then that starts to exist, and then I can notice that, and that can be part of.
So, Clarissa, John is waving me. We have a few minutes for some questions. And I imagine that among our audiences, there are some questions regarding this topic. Please.
Or comments. Oh my God.
Jared, we need John eyes to.
Yeah. The larger context of appropriation presumes the exotic, distinct cultures achievable only in isolation. Could you comment? Yes. I think you may find cultures in isolation today, but that's more of like erroneous idea to actually isolate or to remove power from certain cultures than truly what happens, or at least in my experience. So I don't think I don't see myself dealing with the exotic, but I see myself learning things that I wish I had studied in school. I wish I was taught how to weave in art school in Brazil. Why not? That's an aesthetic tradition that it's like so much part of that region, and why that's not part of the academic formation of an artist. So I feel that I'm actually catching up with things that I unfortunately didn't learn before. And that, yeah, they are not, it's not about, it's the opposite at actually saying that they are exotic. It's actually saying that they are here, they are part of our culture today, and I wanted to be exhibiting my work next to Baniwa contemporary artists. You know.
Thank you. Any other question on this side?
Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what I see as some kind of reclamation through an appropriation of different like invisibilized or inaccessible histories and cultural practices. You mentioned how you never felt that you have to perform or you're read as Latina in the U.S. context, and I see that this is when you talk about people of the Americas. I feel like a reclamation of thinking about how these terms are mapped onto you, and a way for you to take ownership over that and to rewrite some of those attitudes or histories. So if you had any comment about that, I'd really love to hear it.
Yeah, I think you mentioned, I think I use a lot of, so in my work, I do use a lot of strategies that, to use a word that has been overused lately, but like decolonizing strategies, right? Because I think as like an abstract strategy, it serves to any culture, but also to the environment. If you want, it's like it's a way of perceiving the world and dealing with issues that needs to be structurally changed. And I think that's in my work. But I also mention issues of displacement and circulation, because I think that that's where I personally feel that I belong, where everything is semantically or otherwise is a little displaced, right? And how do you claim a space for yourself when everything is a little out of place because we were taught to believe that things are really compartmentalized and segregated in certain ways that they are not, and it's really difficult to negotiate this non-hierarchical place of exchange.
So Clarissa, I think that John is really